Well, it looks like it's time for us to start talking about how our Crave interacts with other gear. Let's start with a Volca, in this case the bass. I don't have any of the Volca drum machines. I had the Beats, but I sold it. That's snare drum. But I expect the functionality will be similar across the line. Now, there are two ways this can go. The Crave can control the Volca, or the Volca can control the Crave. The first one, where this one is the boss, that will be the topic of this video. What you're going to need, obviously, a Crave and a Volca. You'll also need a patch cable, just like the ones that you used in the patch bay. And we're also going to talk about using MIDI, so if you want to grab a MIDI DIN cable, you can do that. Now, this might sound a little strange, but I'm not going to hook up the audio out from the Crave. The blinking sequencer light is actually going to give us the information that we need today. And it saves us from having to figure out which synth is playing and if the pitches work together and stuff like that. What I will do is hook up the audio out from the Volca, but you could just use the internal speaker. I did my original test of this at my desk with just a patch cable and a MIDI cable. Nothing else. Now, if you have looked into the topic of syncing tempo across devices, you have likely encountered terms like 1 PPS, 2 PPQ, 24 PPQ, 1 pulse parentheses coarc, etc. As usual, every company has different ways of doing things. I am not going to be explaining all of that terminology here. Instead, we're going to work through the options on our two instruments and just see what each one actually does. So at this point, be sure you've gone to the Behringer website and downloaded the latest quick start guide for the Crave. As of April 2021, that should read version 3.0 in the bottom left of the first page. They've updated several pages, including page 41, which is the one that we care about today. This is the page that talks about the settings we can alter using Shift-Hold 8, including the assign, patch, and tempo sync information. While you're on that website, download the Synth Tribe if you haven't already. That's the PC or Mac software that will talk to your Behringer. We'll be using that later in this video. I'm going to reset the pattern on my Crave to a single step so we don't have to see too many syncing lights, too many blinking lights. So we're going to push Shift Reset Pattern, and if I push play, we'll see we just get one light flashing at the tempo indicated right here. I also have a 16-step sequence already programmed into my Volca, which is going to sound like this. Okay. To send the tempo out from the Crave, we're going to use the assign patch point. Connect the other end to the sync in on your Volca. The tempo light on the Volca now has stopped flashing because it's now taking its tempo from an external source. So turning this tempo knob on your Volca, even though you'll see the numbers change, isn't going to affect the playback speed at all. Now, when we discussed the assign patch back in video 10 or so, I skipped over the clock options because they dealt with syncing to another instrument. So now it's time to talk about them. We're going to set up our assign output to send clock. Let's start with the simplest one, which is just called clock, which is option 2 on page 2. So Shift Hold 8, page 2, option 2. Press Shift Hold 8 to save. Now if I press play on my sequencer, the Crave is playing its note. Remember, you're not hearing anything. I did not connect any audio out from the Crave today. But the Volca's not doing anything. What I have to do is press play first. Now I press play, but it's waiting. When I press play here, there we go. Now we can see what's happening. And I'll slow the tempo down so it's really obvious. Oh, we'll talk about that in a second too. Each time this blinks once, we get 2 notes from the Volca. 1 and 1, ta 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 ta. Okay. So on assign mode 2, called clock, 1 Crave step equals 2 Volca steps. Now, if I change the tempo on the Crave, the Volca goes with it. Also, note that I can use the swing function. Also, note that when we make changes with our tempo knob, it usually takes a second. Now, let's change to the next assign mode, which is called clock divided by 2. Shift hold 8, page 2, option 3. Shift hold 8 to save. Now when I push play, the Volca says, "What?" And then it settles in. And now we're at 1 sequencer step on the Crave equals 1 sequencer step on the Volca. That one's pretty straightforward. Let's go to our next option. This is page 2, option 4. This is called clock divided by 4. Shift hold 8, page 2, option 4. Shift hold 8 to save. Volca's confused. And there we go. Every 2 steps on the Crave equals 1 step on the Volca. Let's go really slow. Duh. Oh man. Let's stop right there. So this is quite an annoying little behavior. It takes a while for the Volca to figure out what the Crave wants. And regardless of what setting I've chose on either instrument, whether you're setting it to accept a rising or a falling voltage to equal sync, or if none of these words make any sense to you at all, I can't yet find a way for it to be an instantaneous. It always takes a second. So now we're steady again, and we can see 1, 1, 1, and 1, and 1, and 1, and. So, in clock divided by 4, assign output option, page 2, number 4, 2 Craves equals 1 Volca. Now let's remove the patch cable. Now let's try it with MIDI. But let me warn you right now, don't get too excited. We've removed our patch cable, and we're going to use a MIDI cable instead. MIDI out to MIDI in. You need to make sure that your instruments are on the same MIDI channel. On your Crave, remember, we do that with our dip switches. All of them down is channel 1. And to do that on the bass, we will turn on the instrument while holding memory. Okay, so memory, power, and it says channel 1. So this is how you can change the MIDI channel. If I say I wanted to work on MIDI channel 15 for some reason, push the 15 button. We're at channel 1. You press record to memorize that function. And now it's ready to go on channel 1. There's one more thing that we need to check. Again, I'm going to turn off my bass. We need to make sure that MIDI receive short message is turned on the Volca. Otherwise, it won't receive any MIDI information. To do that, we're going to press function and power. And now it's saying it's to the global settings. And MIDI receive short message is option 7. So if the light is off, receive short message is off. And nothing that we do with MIDI is going to affect our bass. So we're going to set MIDI receive short message on with 7. And then just like before, we press record to save. Now, if you're like me and you kept forgetting these little options and which numbers you picked, what I did is I printed out the relevant page from the manual, cut it out, and taped it to the bottom of the instrument. So now I can just take a quick look. Step 7, MIDI short message, LED lit, on. All right. Well, what can we do now? We can use the Crave's keyboard to play the Volca. By the way, there's that glide function that I talked about in my Volca Bass MIDI implementation video. You can't change the portamento on the bass unless you have a device connected which can send control change information to channel 5, which the Crave cannot do. So you'll hear this portamento time. Okay, now another thing to recognize about the bass is it receives MIDI information only on the illuminated or chosen oscillator. So right now I am in group 2, which has these two together. So I'm playing these two oscillators, or I can play oscillator 3. I can switch, so I'm only choosing one oscillator. Da, 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 da. Anyways. Now, because the bass can store 3 lines in its sequencer, what we could do is we could record 2 lines into it and then play a 3rd line on the Crave. So, for example, let's see, memory 5, clear that out. Let's go to group 1, and I'm going to record a little sequence. And notice that as soon as I turn this up, it is doing tempo. We're going to talk about this in a second. But as soon as MIDI is connected, it's always sending clock information. So here we go. Quantizes. Now I can go to oscillator 2. So now it's playing 1 and 2. If I select oscillator 3 now, I can play, using the Crave, the bass's 3rd oscillator. Now, if you press play on your Crave and the bass doesn't start, you need to enable MIDI clock out using the SynthTribe app on your computer. All right, so now you've done that, and when you press play here, it starts the Volca sequencer. But the Crave is also sending its note data to the Volca. So whatever oscillators are lit here is going to play what your Crave is playing. I'm going to reset this pattern. If I mute these 2 oscillators, you'll see it's just sending a C, which is fine. I didn't record anything here. But what if I selected oscillator 2? So I'm going to mute these 2. So that's what I have saved on the bass in the oscillator 2 line. If I press play on my Volca though, it overrides that. So whatever is saved there, the Crave is going to win. It's going to send its MIDI data and overwrite. It's not erasing it, but it will override what is playing there. So now it's playing oscillator 2 what's stored, but it's overriding what's playing in oscillator 1. Let's talk a little bit about the specifics of the Crave MIDI out. We should know exactly what comes out of this port, and it's pretty limited, actually. I did this using a program on my computer called Pocket MIDI, where you can just your computer will monitor whatever MIDI messages are being sent into it, and so I just manipulated the Crave to find out what messages it would send. So let's go through them briefly. The Crave continuously sends out message F8, which is the timing clock, and this is constantly being sent. As soon as you plug your MIDI cable into the Volca is always receiving tempo from this. So that's why, even without pressing play or anything, if I turn this knob down, you can see that this knob blinks very slowly. If I speed it up, it blinks pretty fast. Another message that it'll send is FC, which is stop sequence. That happens when I stop playing a sequence. So if I press play, and then I press stop, the message it sent at the moment I pressed stop was FC. The next thing that your Crave will send is note on and note off information. So, for example, if I was just to hold down a single key, say this one, the message that appears is 903040. And I'm saying it that way because they're hexadecimal numbers, not decimal numbers. So it's base 16, numbers 0 through F. So the 90 part of the message means note on channel 0, or 1 in human counting. The next part, 30, that's the MIDI number for C in hexadecimal notation. So 30 would translate to 48 in decimal. Now the Crave calls that C4, but middle C, as we discovered in our Volca Bass MIDI implementation video, is actually MIDI number 60, which would be 4C in hexadecimal, which would be this number, this key here. So an octave higher than what the Crave says it should be. 40 in the MIDI message refers to velocity. And again, that's in hexadecimal, so it's sending MIDI value 64. Now, since these keys are not velocity sensitive, that number will not change. No matter how light or hard I press them, it's always going to send velocity 40. Even if on your step sequencer, you add an accent, which we know on this raises the cutoff and raises the volume output slightly, that will not change the velocity sent by MIDI. It will still be 40 or 64. When you let go of the key, so when I pressed it, it's sending 903040. When I let go of it, or when the notes gate closes on the sequencer, the message sent is note off. So that would say 803040. And 80 simply means stop playing the note, or note off, again on channel 0 or human 1. Note 30 being C4, and then the velocity of the release 40 or 64. The bass does not receive velocity on note off, so it's not used for anything. And then finally, if you were to press hold and then press it again, this sends message B07B00. And what that means is B0 simply means a control change on channel 0 or channel 1, like we've said, when we normal people start counting from 1, and we're not programmers. 7B is 123 in decimal, and that's an all notes off message. It's essentially a MIDI panic button. So if for some reason a MIDI note got stuck here, you could press hold, and then press it again, and that would send an all notes off message. And then the final part of that, 0, 0, that means nothing. It's just a placeholder because MIDI channel messages have 3 parts. So what does this mean? It means you can't do anything with the Crave's MIDI out to the Volca Bass, essentially, besides play it with the Crave's keyboard and start the sequencer. You can have the sequencers play at the same time, but the notes that are saved in your Crave and will play on your Crave will also be sent to the selected oscillator on your bass, overriding whatever is saved there. Now, you could save a rest into your Crave sequencer, but then what's the point in using it? Because then all it's doing is sending clock, and it doesn't even have a tempo display. And then one final thing, you remember we used Shift-Hold 8 to change the ratio of speeds. So option 2 was 2 Volca clicks per Crave click. Option 3 was a 1-to-1 relationship, and option 4 was 2 Crave steps to 1 Volca step. That only affects the assign output. MIDI out is not at all affected by that. So the MIDI out to the Volca out is simply 1-to-1. So when I push play, ta 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 ta. Exact same speed no matter what option I choose down here. All right, so next time, let's see what happens when we try to control the Crave from the Volca. Now, since the Volca has no MIDI out, the only output that it has is this sync port. So really all we're going to be able to do is see what happens when the Crave is controlled by the Volca's external clock, which, spoilers, is pretty lackluster.